thanks to Bitcoin now, millions of people understand Austrian economics. They read it, they grok how you make a country rich, how money is destructive, how central banks are destructive.
We all say we want world peace, but nobody really ever reflects on what that means. That means no states. That means no taxes.
I honestly haven't seen people this excited since Elon started with Doge. I mean, Americans are just so thrilled to just fire these, million parasites that lord it over us.
No, I have another pet theory that whatever side in any online debate that has the best meme is probably the correct side to be on.
And if your side is doing the good memes, it means that your side has the smart people, not the credentialed people, not the people with the PhDs.
American workers are not going to get less spoiled and less fat because you put a tariff on another country. That's just not how the economy works.
Rich people love inflation. Right? The biggest people who would suffer if the Fed closed down would be billionaires. If you succeed in shutting out Donald Trump, okay, you might manage it. You've got all the media, you've got all these tools. You might manage to shut him out. But if you do that, you're not going to like what comes next.
Professor St Onge, welcome to the Bitcoin Infinity Show. Great to have you here.
Thanks for having me on. I've been meaning to do this for a long time. We've been, interacting on Twitter and online, and we never got around to doing this. So thank you.
No, fantastic to have you here. And I love to be able to address you as professor because I was in Lugano giving a lecture on praxeology this summer. I was there for a week for the summer school. So I had students and they all addressed me as professor. And so I know how good that feels to be called professor.
And I figure it's no lose. Like either I say really smart things and then people say, well, he's a professor, I guess he's smart. Or I say things that are so stupid that I bring down the global brand of the PhD, knock it off its throne and strike a blow for the common man. So it's it's a no lose proposition leading with the PhD.
No, either way you win. I mean, there's been inflation in titles, especially on LinkedIn. Everyone's a CEO or a project manager or a team leader or something. There's like no blue collar jobs anymore, it seems.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I'm an automotive professional if I, wash cars for a living. Yeah.
Yeah. So we have a social media manager, and he used to be the social media manager, but at the conference in Helsinki, we decided just because of this inflation in titles to promote him. So he's now head retard, and he can tweet away whatever he likes. Anyway,
acted by all the other retards. Yeah,
it's a very noble title. Anyway, for our listeners that don't know about you, don't know who you are, can you give us not to DR, but a TL on who you are, like your background and how you got into Bitcoin and Austrian economics and all that?
For sure. So I am an economist. I have a PhD from George Mason University, which is kind of the mothership of Austrian economics. There's a lot of practicing Austrians who teach there. For those who don't know Austrian economics, it's basically economics without government. So economics as a field was taken over by government because it's extremely useful, right, to a central planner to figure out how to take over society and how to use incentives to try to nudge people to do things that are statist and, often fascist. At any rate, it was too attractive a target. And so governments took it over, what we now call Keynesianism. And so I'm an Austrian, so I believe in freedom, liberty, individual sovereignty, John Locke's second treatise. And that took me to Murray Rothbard. So I found him in the 90s in a random bookstore. I'd actually done my undergrad at a top school in Canada, McGill University. I'd never heard of Austrian economics. And so I found it in this random bookstore in Tokyo. There was nothing, to read. This is back before the internet. And so that, sort of led me down the rabbit hole. And it took me to, because of that Austrian grounding. So in Austrian economics, money is a good just like any other, right? You buy socks because, to cover your feet. You buy a car to carry groceries and pick up chicks, right? Every good has a number of features to it, and money has features. So money is not some mystical sort of Wizard of Oz, draped over everything. Money is just a good, and people buy it so that they can preserve purchasing power for later and so on. And so with that framework, sort of the demystification of money, when I came across Bitcoin back in, probably 2010, I thought, this is pretty cool. Now, I didn't buy it because I assumed that governments would ban it. And I'm not the only one, right? The reason why he is Satoshi is because he also assumed that they were going to try to arrest everybody that had anything to do with Bitcoin. So in my defense, it was an understandable misperception. But anyway, I was convinced that they would ban it, and they should have banned it. They're absolute idiots for not banning it. But anyway, they didn't. They didn't get their stuff together. And so here we are today. I wrote the first pro-Bitcoin article at Mises.com. This back in late 2014, basically arguing that the fundamental theory why Mises says that gold is real money also applies to Bitcoin, because it's not a question of can you drop it on a foot? It's a question of can you do something useful with it? And at that time, what you could do useful with Bitcoin was that the fees were near zero and you could be anonymous, right? Which are both extremely useful depending on how repressive your government is. Anyway, so that was 2014. Thanks to Jeff Deist, who was president at the time. Mises had traditionally been very pro-gold and therefore somewhat anti-Bitcoin. And so Jeff Deist was open to the idea. He published it. He ran interference. And ever since then, I think that there's been a widespread association of the Bitcoin community with Austrian economics. That wasn't me. That was, Nick Szabo, for example, was very pro-Austrian economics. But at any rate, that's been something that's made me very happy, because Austrian was sort of obscure. It had been outbid by government-run Keynesian economics. And thanks to Bitcoin now, I think millions of people understand Austrian economics. They read it. They grok like how you make a country rich, how money is destructive, how central banks are destructive.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, for me, it was I was sort of pushed over the edge to really fall deep in the Mises rabbit hole by Seyfedin, I guess, and and the likes of Seyfedin, like other Bitcoiners promoting the works of Mises and Rothbard first and foremost. Are you familiar with Konrad Graf?
I am. Yes,
yeah,
absolutely.
He was a Mises guy who was very early saying some really clever things about Bitcoin, and sort of forgotten in the space, unfortunately. But he's really great.
Yeah, he is great. In that article that I was pimping earlier, I cited him in that. He's a brilliant guy.
Yeah, always great to talk to fellow Austrians. One of my favorite books on Austrian economics is a Hoppe book called Economic Science and the Austrian Method. But that one was really... that and The Ethics of Liberty by Rothbard, those are the two that really changed my perspective on things. And especially the whole, the realization that the empiricists claim that we cannot know anything to 100% certainty is a logical contradiction in itself. Because if that statement is true, then it cannot be true, because then we know that to 100% certainty. And it's that's sort of like the very baseline of what separates anything that has to do with human action, anything that has to do with free choice and agency. There is no room for empiricism whatsoever. If you throw a rock into a pond, you can figure out where it's going to land on the seabed. But if you throw a human being into the pond, they can swim whatever direction they want. So like, and this, for me, that's what made it click for me. Did you have such a moment where you sort of realized that this is reality, it's not just opinion?
Yeah, I don't know if it's exactly that. I mean, I think that you're absolutely correct. The positivist revolution has been, I think, catastrophic within economics. In other words, the idea that, you just sort of start and correlate things with statistics, and then you can arrive at truth that way. And that's given us two things. First of all, you can manipulate statistics to an unlimited degree. Like anybody who's worked in academia, you can play with that crap all day long. The joke is, if you torture statistics long enough, they'll say anything you want. And then the other problem is that if you don't understand cause and effect, if you're just sort of observing it as this neutral, disinterested party, almost like a jury in a trial, which is the Milton Friedman method, right? Explicitly, this is probably the most famous article in academia arguing for empiricism, for arriving at truth through observation. And this is the scientific method. And so if you do it that way, in other words, if you drop all knowledge of what's causing what, for example, the knowledge, essentially what Mises laid out in human action, that for example, let's say people buy money or people trade goods for money because the money is doing something for them, right? That's a praxeological point of view, whereas these sort of Friedman positivist or mainstream point of view would just be, you sort of look at people and say, well, they seem to want money. We don't know why, but they want money. And then if you tweak this, if you make the interest rate, 7%, then they want money a little bit less. And they don't really understand what's happening. And so what that ends up doing is that every time the system breaks, and it breaks a lot, people don't appreciate how often certainly the financial system breaks. The Fed comes in and pours $1 trillion on top of it to put out the fire. So people don't appreciate how often it breaks. But every time it does break, they're just completely blindsided. They have no idea what happened. We saw that in 2008. There was this famous exchange where Queen Elizabeth went to London School of Economics, which was the mothership of the communist Keynesian revolution. And she asked them, so, okay, we just had this, worldwide global financial crisis. How come none of you guys saw it coming? And I mean, it's fun. You can probably find clips of it, but they're all there like, well, it's hard to say, But we learned a lot from this disaster, so we think maybe it won't happen again. Every single time it's the same story because they are completely blind to what the actual economic relationships are. Like, why do people want money? Why do people produce versus consume? That extends out to decisions in life. Why do people commit crime? There's, all of these models that come out of praxeology that mainstream economics is just completely blinded, partly because they're relying too much on the numbers. And, as you say, a human sinks in a pond, all things equal. But of course, you have to understand that humans are not rocks. Humans have motivation. They engage, they invest effort to achieve ends, which include not drowning to death. And so you have to understand all of those causal relationships in order to actually understand what's happening in the economy. Otherwise, time and time again, the mainstream is blind. Of course, that's a tragedy. There was a study out of Switzerland that estimated that in the 2008 crisis, in the United States alone, something like 250,000 excess deaths were registered because people lost their jobs, they lost their businesses, they lost their life savings. So, this is life or death. For all Greta Thunberg gets excited about whatever's happening in the news, these questions of, Federal Reserve, monetary policy, the sort of machinations of the system, these are not just sort of academic, how many angels on the head of a pin, these are life and death.
Yeah, and there's, as you say, the empiricism, as soon as you bake that into the equation anywhere, it creates all these misconceptions and this, like, you can get an approximation. And of course, if you do economic appraisement and you're personally going to figure out if you're going to buy something or not, then that's when statistics can be useful to you. But making decisions for others, like to begin with, it's completely immoral. And this is like such a big blind spot in every single human being, I think. Like we all say we want world peace, but nobody really ever reflects on what that means. That means no states. That means no taxes. That means no inflation. There can't be any threats of violence during world peace. Then it's not peace. And that's never a piece of the puzzle. So why do you think that is? Why have statist ideas grown so big? Why aren't more people anarcho-capitalists?
Yeah, I think fundamentally it comes down to two things. One of them is that money talks, and the other is that there are economies of scale to violence. So there's a Thomas Sowell quote that's similar to what you're saying, where he notes that the left cares very deeply about poor people. At least they allege that they do. And so they should be very, very interested in creating prosperity, right? They should be interested in questions like marginal tax rates and, what is the impact on business formation and, or minimum wages, because another way to phrase minimum wage is let's ban low wage or low skilled jobs. So they might be interested in all these things and, they might be very, very open to listening to free marketers discuss how to create prosperity. But, I think a lot of listeners have had discussions with left-wingers where they have not seemed very interested in actually learning how to create prosperity. On the contrary, they seem to get angry at you for suggesting that there's any way to create prosperity that doesn't involve government program. And so I think what's fundamentally happening here is that the sort of human inherent sympathy for the underdog has been hijacked and weaponized and commoditized into, the administrative state or the deep state, whatever you like, into this permanent bureaucracy who has, essentially converted that innate sympathy into trillions of dollars of money. And so, yes, you've got the sort of useful activists who push these things, who, go out and demonstrate and march, for socialist policies. The vast majority of them they're either not being paid or they're not being paid very much. But it's upstream of that it has been, sort of captured as this pool of power. And then, so, why did that happen? Like, why fundamentally are people able to capture the state? And, in this case, sort of to convert the social welfare function into a profit center. Why are they able to do that? And I think the answer there is just simply that violence pays. Anarchy is, you can make a case that anarchy, in other words, the absence of government where people just do it bottom up, you can make a case that's a much better way to organize society. You can also make a case that gold is a much better money. Neither, right? There is no country today that uses gold as the main money. There is no country that uses anarchy as the main system. So could that be because it's an evolutionary process where actually gold is terrible and confetti is awesome? No, I think it's violence. There is a, sort of visible hand that interferes in this evolutionary process that imposes a set of preferences of people who are able to organize themselves. Now, what's interesting there, I think, is that the biggest story right now, in my opinion, is the internet and what the internet is doing to civil society. Because if you look back, the big moment for Europe, right, most of history, and especially Sweden, Sweden was an absolute, it was a shithole country. It was a backwoods, pardon my French. All right. It had no written language of its own. I guess maybe there were ruins, but I think those were Germanic. It had no culture. It had no cities. It was as bad as Japan. It was just a total wasteland. The civilization was in Rome, right? It was in, the Middle East. And all of a sudden, somewhere around 1300, Sweden flips, Europe flips, right? Europe goes from zero to hero. And if we look at what specifically happened there, I think it was the Reformation, right? Where you had this moment, it was based on a very, very cheap technology, which was the printing press. The printing press had existed in China for 300-400 years at that point. Gutenberg is associated with it. But anyway, various people imported the printing press. What the printing press did is that took you from a world where you had to hire a bunch of monks to hand letter books with gold leaf. Okay, it took you from that world to a world where you could mass produce thousands of leaflets. And these leaflets could talk about, let's say, tax rates. And they could invite people to gather at the town square next Sunday. Okay, and, bring farm implements. All right, that transformed the power where instead of a standing army being able to crush the plebs, in which case you had no property rights, it sort of looked like one of these extractive African regimes where we have a very, very tiny elite who does very, very well. Then everybody else is living in abject poverty like North Korea or something. You went from that world to one where now people had rights because, the printing press was the Second Amendment. The printing press was their credible threat to say to the elites, if you don't give us rights, this is going to end badly for you. And, there were a series of peasant revolts. The most famous, of course, is the French Revolution. But that fundamentally, in my opinion, is it's what shifted the power from that, elite who captured all this. It shifted it to the people. And then secondly, that led to a series of rights, sort of negotiated settlements between elites and the common people, which then established property rights that allowed Europe to become incredible. And then places like Sweden became one of the richest places on earth. So with all that, if we look at the internet right now, right, social media is the printing press. The internet, broadly speaking, whether it's blogs, sort of the earlier version of the internet, it is Gutenberg 2.0. And, the establishment absolutely understands that. That's why they're censoring. They're censoring in Europe as we speak. It was almost as bad in America until recently, thanks to Elon Musk. So they're fighting back, but they can't crush it. Also when the printing press came out, governments tried to ban it. It was illegal to own a printing press. They had to be licensed. Still to this day, I think printing presses are required to have little serial numbers that they put on stuff. That's from the censorship age. Post offices were, the only purpose of a post office is to censor, right? Traditionally, a merchant would come through town. They would take letters to the next town, be in a sealed bag, and he would be able to charge. And if he opened the bag, then nobody would use him anymore because they'd say he's a fraud. All right, there was a perfectly legitimate free market version of a post office. Governments created post offices. They banned the private carry of mail, and they priced the post offices very, very cheap so they could wipe out the competition. The reason they did that is so they could open the letters, okay? So governments always censor. What we're seeing in the European Union right now, where they're arresting British people for memes, I mean, welcome to human history. But the reason they're doing that is because we are in a Gutenberg 2.0, which is why, it's easy to get discouraged because we are outgunned. We're certainly out-dollared 100 to 1, 1,000 to 1, we being we who believe in liberty. But when you look at that, right, when you look at history and you look at what the internet is doing and social media is doing, and then if you combine that now with Bitcoin, which offers the economic rail, right, if you've got free speech, but you can't eat, you're not going to have a long career, right? You're going to be discouraged from speaking your mind. Bitcoin, we saw during the Canadian trucker protests that Bitcoiners were going around and trying to help truckers because the Canadian government had made it so that they literally could not go out and buy a sandwich. They could not pay their mortgage, right? The Canadian government was trying to crush them, and Bitcoin was the way out. So if you put those two together, for me, the internet and Bitcoin, I am extremely bullish on these next 10 or 15 years. Europe, I think, is going to get a lot worse before it gets better. I think there's going to be a lot of blood in Europe before this thing ends. But I think Europe is probably actually going to leapfrog. 10 or 15 years from now, Europeans are going to look back at somebody like Donald Trump and think that he was, that's like your parents. He wasn't exciting. He was very, very moderate. So I think things in Europe, I don't know if that's good news or bad news, but I think Europe is headed for the end game.
Yeah, a lot of thoughts around that. I mean, I'm in Europe. I'm from Sweden, but I'm sitting in Spain right now. I live in Spain. And here in Spain, I would say I'm not that worried about the bureaucracy because it eats itself. Like, it's so ridiculously stupid down here and slow. Like, everything is mañana. And everything takes forever. So I know that, I can do my Bitcoin business as much as I like. They're never going to figure anything out. They're just too incompetent. And this is a thing about people who hate the state. Sometimes you hear that the state is stupid and the state is the most clever thing ever at the same time, and I don't really buy it. It's never mistake retardation for 4D chess. I mean, they can't be both the cleverest. I mean, I guess some of these three-letter institutions can be, but it's hard to predict the future, of course. But here, as long as we have Bitcoin and a free internet in Europe, I think we're pretty safe. There are still parts of Europe that are very safe in terms of walking around in the city and whatnot. Then again, I moved from Sweden. One of the reasons is the escalating violence and the problems with that. I mean, if there was a murder in Sweden when I grew up, that was like national news for 2 years. Yeah. Now there's one every week, and people don't. It's a disaster, of course. Yeah, I have a pet theory. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, and that is how Bitcoin absolutely fixes this. Because, as you say, now, I mean, we're without borders right now. We can do this. We can talk to each other, and we can broadcast it to almost the entire planet, and no one stops us from doing that. But when you combine it with Bitcoin, as you say, I think Bitcoin removes the incentive for violence, because I can point a gun at your head and say, Peter, give me all your Bitcoins, and you can give me whatever percentage of your total amount you want, but there's no way for me, the attacker, to know how much you really had.
Right.
And in the long run, to me, that means if I extrapolate that thought vector into the future as far as possible, that means that reduces the profitability of aggression enormously. Because I mean, you can take my house, but if I have 99 houses worth of Bitcoin in my head, if you kill me, you couldn't get any of that. So it's more profitable for you to, in the long run at least, to give me something of value back and trade with me rather than attack me. So what do you think of that theory? Is it correct?
Yeah, well, it's correct, and it scales massively. So, in my mind, the reason why I love Bitcoin so much is that if you look back through world history, you have these cycles, these monetary cycles, where you start out with something hard like gold, and prices are stable, and governments constantly, it's like a cat trying to push something off a table, right? Just time. I mean, you have to constantly watch them because they're trying to do it. They're trying to debase it somehow. So they're clipping the coins. The great innovation was, of course, paper money. So paper money came from warehouse receipts for actual gold. And once you can print warehouse receipts, well, that's off to the races. So they're constantly trying to debase, and this has been for thousands of years. It was in the Roman Empire. Every single empire you look at, you look at the Mughal Empire, you can look at Abbasid, empire in Egypt. Every single empire through history, the Chinese empires, collapsed, or the hallmark of their collapse. Okay, like if you want to time exactly when the golden age starts and when the golden age collapses, it's the money. Always they go directly for the money. They steal it. And once you start stealing money, that then it causes a whole cascade of factors. But among them are property rights erode, people stop investing, people start running down, they start eating the seed instead of planting it, just, a whole cascade of events. And the decline of the Roman Empire is sort of a perfect illustration of this. The trick is, so you get into that debasement stage, things go bad, you get hyperinflation eventually. And then, you often get civil war, you get barbarian invasion because the military aren't being paid and so on. And what always happens is you get a collapse, and then everybody is scared straight, and they say, well, we learned our lesson. We're going to go back to gold again. And they do. And they stick with it for a while. Maybe it's 20 years, maybe it's 40, maybe it's 200. And then once again, you will eventually have, another devil in the government, and they will manage to succeed to break that once again. And so you get these cycles just over and over and over. And Bitcoin breaks that because fundamentally Bitcoin cannot be seized, right? So if you want to base a currency system on gold, it'd be very hard to pay your Netflix bill with gold coins, right? You'd have to drive over to Netflix and pay them with the gold coins. And even if you did that, the gold coins are sitting there on Netflix, right? You actually need to have the physical gold somewhere. You can't say to people, okay, I have a secret stash of gold, which is backing my currency, Peter coin, but I can't tell you where it is. All right, it's hidden, right? It's not going to work. What you have to do instead, if you're going to base a currency on gold, you have to tell people where it is. You have to say it's at, 1212, Mayberry Lane. It's got to have walls. It's got to have the sharks with the lasers on the head, right? It's got to be somewhere that people can actually identify it. Maybe you even have a camera on it, like in the early internet, right? They had the cameras looking at the coffee machine. So you have a camera looking at your gold. Good. So now government can very, very easily find that gold, and they're going to have ideas about what they'd like you to do with it. So gold, this is sort of the irony, right? Gold bugs, and I do love gold. Gold bugs love gold because it's physical. You can drop it on your foot, you can feel it, you can touch it. That is also the ultimate vulnerability of gold, right? That is why we have these cycles over and over and over. Like with writing, it's not like humans invented writing and then forgot it and screwed up and then reinvented it, okay? Like writing, we figured it out and we kept it. Somehow, with hard money, we keep letting it go over and over and over. And I think that that's the reason, right? Is going back to the efficiency of violence, it is fundamentally easy to take over any gold-based system. That is what I think Bitcoin breaks. So that now, eventually, because it's been going on for thousands of years, we're eventually going to have another cycle. We're going to have another hyperinflation, and then we're going to have a collapse. People like you or me are trying to delay it. I mean, there are accelerationists out there, but I'm generally trying to delay it because I don't want the suffering that comes in between. But eventually, we are going to have another one of those. And the next one that hits, I think there are very good odds that we go to Bitcoin. If it happens soon, we're going to go to gold. We won't go to Bitcoin because not enough people know Bitcoin. If it happens in 40, 50 years, I think we're just going to go straight to Bitcoin. At that point, it ends. It's like writing, right? Like at that point, we have hard money and we don't lose it because it cannot be seized.
So speaking of that, you sound very long-term bullish, as am I, but there are threats to Bitcoin. Like what is your stance on the current Core 30 versus NOTs debate? How much have you looked into this, and how much of an existential threat, if any, do you think this is?
So I have not followed it closely, and I'm also not technical. I am completely retarded technically. So with that caveat, I mean, my general impression, first off, I think it's wonderful that we have these knockdown battles where we call each other names. libertarianism, I think, got completely taken over by the state because everybody was too nice to each other. So, screw that. I think it's fine that, the cartoon mages, I think it's fine. It's part of the game, no holds barred. So, I'm not complaining about that. I think that what we have in Bitcoin, I think, which, often in interviews, people ask, okay, but, what about all these other shit coins, right? So you got shit coins that settle in 3 seconds and, they have all these features and the bells and whistles and the whole thing. And fundamentally, my response to all those is that what Bitcoin has that nobody else has, certainly in any blockchain-based asset, is that social layer. And our social layer is an almost perfect natural elite, right? There are a couple people who get a little extra boost because they hung out in core. Broadly speaking, we are extraordinarily sort of free market in terms of who people listen to. So, my general attitude is it's a well-functioning market in terms of the sort of market of the debate, the arguments of the two sides. I'm not concerned at all that we're going to come out to the right conclusion, but in terms of the actual pros and cons, I am useless in terms of having any kind of valuable contribution to add.
Oh, okay. So let's not go deeper into that, but I'd like to propose a more abstract thought experiment, because this is sort of my Austrian take on anything like this, or shitcoins on Bitcoin, or spam on Bitcoin in general. So right now, since the money isn't working, money is broken, the dollar is broken, the euro is broken, what happens is that people, and I know you agree to this, so I'm just laying it out for the listeners. So people are using real estate as a store of value. And or I prefer to call it a medium of exchange over time than store of value, since you can't really store value, since value is subjective, because that's Austrian autism here or something. But anyway, they are using real estate as a store of value. Let's call it that for ease sake, which makes it a worse form of housing for human beings, because it's now not being used as housing. I live next to an area here in Spain where the houses are completely empty. People use them only for investment, and they're here maybe 2 weeks a year, and no one lives in them. So it's very telling that is their main purpose, is to provide their owners with a store of value. So, but I think that for money, the opposite of that is true. So any other use case for money than medium of exchange over time and space, or store of value, medium of exchange, unit of account, actually makes a form of money worse at those aspects. So for instance, and I know both Mises and Rothbard talked about this, about gold actually being worse as a form of money because it's use case in jewelry and in its industrial use cases, because it misprices things when there's an additional use case. And I think the same is true for Bitcoin. If Bitcoin is, dick pic storage, that makes using it as a medium of exchange more expensive, and it makes starting up a new node more expensive. So not maybe you push some people out of the market. It's no longer available. It's no longer an option to buy a Raspberry Pi and run it on. For instance, you need a slightly more powerful computer and more disk space than that. So what's your take on that? What do you think about that argument?
Yeah, I think that's accurate. It sort of gets to the big block, small block question and the, distribution of miners. I think that's true, but then, you've got the sort of counter case so if you take gold, for example, it may be worse that it's got this additional noise. I don't think the noise on gold is that big of a deal, because for the same reason that any arbitrary amount of money would serve, even though gold has this additional demand to it, that boosts the price of it, and it may do that gradually over time. But still, for the average person using gold, the fact that, so in other words, if gold is 20% more expensive because it has these outside uses, well, if you go and work a day picking fruit and you get paid in gold, and then a year later you use it to, buy a car, the fact that the original gold was boosted 20%, and the year later gold was boosted by 20% is irrelevant, right? So, in a sort of absolute pure sense, does gold suffer from the fact that it has this sort of additional noise? Yes, but then on the other hand, the question would be, okay, well, if you wanted to get rid of that, then would there be any trade-offs on that? And so, for example, policing what's happening on Bitcoin, limiting the messages, is there some, bad side to that? Like, for example, wrapped Bitcoin. And, people have talked about sort of programmable Bitcoin. And I mean, obviously that's a can of worms. There's a lot of questions there in terms of attack surface. But yes, I would agree with you that it's better to have something that's just purely money that doesn't have this extra demand to it. But I also think that it's not that big a deal for the average user. It boosts it, but unless that boost itself is dramatically fluctuating. An analogous question would be that, so a ton of Bitcoin demand is of course speculative, right? And these are people who are, 50xing on, exchanges. This is something that just came up last week when we had a bunch of blowouts last Friday. I think it was 19 billion got liquidated. So is that a problem? Yes. It makes Bitcoin far more volatile than it would otherwise be. However, there's also benefits to it, right? So one of them is that price discovery. Yes, there's a lot of noise, but what kind of shifts out the bottom of that speculation is price discovery ultimately. And moreover, if you wanted to try to ban that somehow, then what would the trade-offs be?
Yeah, I think the differentiator here between gold and Bitcoin is that a 20% more valuable gold makes it 20% easier to carry around, right? Because you can carry more value for less. But in Bitcoin, that's the opposite. If there's other use cases, it gets more expensive to quote unquote carry around because it gets more expensive to run a node. So I think that's the difference. Even though, there's a good argument to be made that it doesn't matter that much. I mean, there's a lot of other theories here, but let's stay off that topic because I've talked too much about it, I think.
Hello there, children. Have you ever thought about a $5 wrench attack or $15 wrench attack? What if someone were to hit you on the head and try to take your Bitcoin with this? Bitcoin transactions are irreversible, and if someone else gets access to your private keys, your money is gone. Bitvault is the first Bitcoin wallet that protects you from both physical and digital attacks. It upgrades security with multi-sig and time lock, which is a very interesting feature of Bitcoin. This means that transactions are locked for 2 hours to 15 days, giving you enough time to intervene and revert the transaction so the money goes back to you, even though the attacker thinks they got access to the money. So head to bitvault.sv to secure your lifetime subscription now. There are only 42 of those available for $199. Time is running out. I often talk about how we are the Satoshis. The Bitcoiners are the Bitcoin network. In other words, the success of other Bitcoiners is the success of the Bitcoin network. And I've been secretly helping out working on a fantastic app for the last 3 years called Club Orange, formerly known as the Orange Pill app. This is a great way to get to know other Bitcoiners. You can get on the app easily. You can also get your own referral code to onboard other people. It comes at a cost, but that is to filter out spam and bots and people who ask you how your trade is going. This is not just a gay dating app. It's a fantastic way to find other Bitcoiners, find merchants, find events, to group chat, to video chat. There's a Bitcoin wallet inside that is the least KYC'd Bitcoin wallet in the world almost. And it's also a fantastic app overall for all of these things. So get on Club Orange right now and find other Bitcoiners near you.
So what's going on? Like, how involved are you with the Mises Institute these days?
I'm not nowadays. I was working for Heritage Foundation for a couple of years, and they're more sort of traditionally conservative. So they hired me specifically to be a disruptive force inside the organization to try to get them out of some of that status stuff. So Heritage, like in DC, people talk about the old heritage and the new heritage. So the new heritage is much, much more base than it used to be, which is something I'm proud of. But yeah, I mean, I'm much more involved now on specific policy. So I make these daily videos, and typically I'll talk about whatever's happening in the news that week. So, for example, this week it's the RIFs coming out, the permanent layoffs coming out of the government shutdown in the U.S., which Americans are very, very excited. I honestly haven't seen people this excited since Elon started with Doge. I mean, Americans are just so thrilled to just fire these, million parasites that lord it over us. Some of the other topics this week have been silver, right? Silver has been absolutely on fire. Do you know silver, the volatility on silver now is half that of Bitcoin over the past year. I mean, so, silver is just out of control. And of course, what's driving silver and gold and Bitcoin are all fundamentally the debasement trade, right? The idea that government deficits are out of control. That's something it's really worldwide. I think the US might be 6% of GDP. Europe generally is about 3 to 4%, which even 3 or 4, I mean, that was only in the worst of a recession that you would have deficits that bad. We're not in the worst of recessions right now. People debate whether we're in it, but fundamentally, this is not the 2008 crisis that we're in. So to have sort of structural deficits of 3, 4, or 6% suggests that the end game is coming. I did a video recently talking about gold, where if you go back 20 years ago, the entire market capitalization of gold was something like 2 or 4% of world GDP. And today it's something like 20%. World monetary base. Okay. And the reason that matters is that is getting us essentially what's happening sort of under the surface is that the world is switching the hard money. It's doing it very, very quickly. Now, of course, if we did Bitcoin, it would be from 0.000 nothing to, what is it now? I don't know, about 2%, I think, of fiat, which is, so sort of zooming out in terms of the sort of end game on fiat currency, I think it's actually very exciting what's happening now. It's concerning in the short term. I think that we're going to have more and more countries blow up. France looks like it might be heading into a lot of trouble. They appear incapable of forming a government. Britain just last year had some trouble. I think they had short-term interest rates in double digits, which is rare for Britain. I think we are coming into the end game here. And, it's an interesting sort of parlor game at that point to ask. So, first off, when do you think fiat's going to die? Because it always dies. It's died hundreds, thousands of times. And then the second question, do we go directly to gold, or do we skip gold and go to Bitcoin this time? That, I think, in terms of sort of watching the horse race, interpreting the various stories, the government shutdown, the French deadlock, sort of interpreting these things in terms of that fiat collapse, I think these are very, very interesting times.
Yeah, absolutely. Speaking of Elon Musk there, it's been seeing public service news outlets in Sweden and what the left-wingers there thought about. I have this theory that whenever people are cheering for Elon Musk, he's done something bad, like taking government subsidies to do environmentally friendly cars. And whenever they are upset with him, he's done something good. Yeah. So, for instance, when he allowed free speech again on Twitter, or when he the Doge thing, that was obviously great. I mean, just the figures, like this US aid thing, they owned a big chunk of the BBC, for instance, over in the UK, and they owned so many media outlets in Europe, or were heavily invested in. It's like this whole threat to democracy slogan is exported from the US, and it's been used over here in Europe en masse since years back. And it's all manufactured. It's disgusting.
Well, it's hilarious because the European left despises America, everything about America, right? And what's shocking is that all this woke crap, I mean, all this stuff with the rainbow flags on Parliament, all of that was just pumped out, mass produced in America, and all these stupid European leftists are just lapping it up like children. It's just absolutely hilarious. But yeah, all that stuff was manufactured. What's exciting about it is, yes, it's enraging that our tax dollars are used to wage civil war against us, or to promote the communist superstate. But what's fun about it is that it suggests that nobody actually believes in this crap, right? It is completely manufactured. Yes, you've got, naive 18-year-olds who don't know any better, and, because their tax-funded teachers taught them this. Sure, but they're going to hit reality. They're going to, have to pay their mortgage, and their kids are going to be in school, and, they shake out of it. But the sort of implication of what we found during Doge is that whether it's the US, Europe, Japan, across the world, these left-wing, what we thought were these, sort of world dominating movements taking over the young people. And, this was the future. Actually, all this crap was astroturfed. And so now that it's not shut off yet, because, a lot of these guys put money away and they haven't choked off all the money. There's been a lot of lawsuits in the US, lawfare. And in Europe, of course, they haven't even begun to cut this stuff. So, there's still a lot of money flowing. And so I don't think we've seen a huge decline yet. But it is exciting because it sort of raises the prospect that if you can cut off the tax money, these organizations, they don't actually exist. Nobody cares about any of this stuff. Nobody wants mass migration. Like, who exactly, who wants this, right? Who wants inflation? Who wants, bank bailouts? Like, nobody actually wants any of this stuff. It happens because there is a wall of money, tax money, that's pushing it, but nobody wants it. So again, that makes it very exciting when we live in an age where technology, as much as governments try to fight it, technology is delivering this sort of free speech agora. I think it's very exciting what's going to happen next. I think we're going to go, it'll be 2 steps forward, 1 back, but I think we're going to go from victory to victory.
Yeah, and absolutely. The youth everywhere is more right-wing than they ever were. The left has been playing hard on this. Greta, too. Back to our friend Greta, she's the pet lefty youth representation character, right? But everyone hates her. Like in her generation, they're not winning that war. On some fronts they're doing better than on others, but I think the general movement and I saw this ridiculous from one thing to another here. This is my ADD brain just scattering around, but I saw this wonderful little segment of, once again, Swedish public service news media, the state-funded stuff. And they were trying to figure out why the more free speech a social media platform was, the more right-wing it was. Or the more and they figured that, and they had all these explanations, that the left wingers are more fact oriented, so therefore because of the algorithms that upsets people, that triggers these, so they want everyone to be left side of the bell curve type right winger with a pickup truck and a shotgun, but that's not it. Could it be that ideas thrive when questioned, and when actually there's a battle of ideas, good ideas win, and your idea is not that good?
Yeah. Well, talk about lack of self-awareness, right? So if I hold a gun over everybody, they talk about the things I like, but if I don't have a gun, they talk about stuff I don't like. They must be crazy.
Yeah. That's literally the conclusion they came to.
This is you. Yeah, no, it's very exciting. And, keep in mind, so you're talking about, American youth is going right, German youth, British youth, French youth, and that's all with the education system, right? The first thing that the socialists did, starting in 1870s, 1880s, the very first thing they did, the Fabian strategy, was to take over education, because they knew darn well that that's the long-term game, right? If you can brainwash the kids, they eventually become voters. You brainwash their kids, one more step, and you eventually turn everybody into North Koreans. So can you imagine what those percents would be if those kids didn't have to go to day prison for 12 years and get pumped all this propaganda in? Not just pump the propaganda, but in an environment where if they disagree, bad things happen to them. They get bad grades, they get thrown out of school, they have to go to reform school and hang out with the guys who, sniff glue. Right. So imagine what those percents would be without the government putting their finger on the scale. It would be 98%. Nobody believes this crap. Nobody believes that you want the Department of Motor Vehicles to run your life. All right. Everybody thinks, whether it's true or not, okay, because some people are bad at running their own lives, okay? But whether it's true or not, everybody wants to run their own life. This is humanity. People have died for that many, many times through history. So yeah, that's hilarious that they're, wringing their hands like, what? Why is it? It must be the algorithm. It must be, Musk, posted memes. We need to get better at memes, which is hilarious. The whole left thing where they're trying to learn memes. And it's like your 50-year-old uncle has decided to be cool.
No, I have another pet theory that whatever side in any online debate that has the best meme is probably the correct side, to be honest. They're probably closer to the truth than the other side.
It's valid because memes are an IQ measure. All right. And if your side is doing the good memes, it means that your side has the smart people, not the credentialed people, not the people with the PhDs. In fact, the opposite of that. Right. And I've pretty much given up, by the way, debating PhDs. They are the most closed-minded people, which is hilarious because the image of universities, right? Like the slogan of Harvard is Lux et Veritas, light and truth. Okay,
Yeah.
so like the whole purpose of that, right? Nike makes shoes, Ford makes trucks, and universities make truth. And if you actually talk to any of these people, the vast majority don't care about anything. They're just, it's a paycheck. What are you going to do? But the ones who do care are just shockingly closed-minded. So yeah, there is zero hope there.
My friend Daniel Prince once gave me a sentence that was so good, so I put it in one of the books, and that is, if you were a straight A student, you excelled at being average.
Or you were obedient. Yeah, you were
so you're
obedient.
literally in the middle of the bell curve, like a peak. And no, it doesn't reward independent thinking. Yeah, come to think of it, when my daughter started school, like a couple of years back in Sweden, her first day at school, there was a big gathering in the schoolyard. And the first thing the headmaster said was, this year we're going to focus a little extra on the climate. Like, what the fuck? Why can't you focus on, multiplication of the alphabet or something that is more basic than you have to start this shit instantly? But no, it's completely taken over. The problem with the right-wing youth we talked about in Sweden is that the quote-unquote right-wingers there are the Sweden Democrats, which is like what they call the far right there. And I think the main problem with them is that they're socialists. They're just the Social Democrats used to be 50% of the voter base, and now they're 25, and this new party is 25. So where did they come from? Of course it's the old Social Democrats. So they still believe in that shit, that Sweden is good because of the Scandinavian model. And the thing is, all the success of the Nordics were like before, they've just been handing out the loot afterwards. And it's not going very well at the moment.
This is a core problem. Nationalism and socialism are both extremely popular, and they're inherently popular. Nationalism I like anyway. And for the record, I want everybody to be nationalist. I want Swedes to be nationalists for their country. I want Koreans to be nationalists. I want Mexicans to love their country. Okay. I love nationalism across the board. And of course, the left tries to portray this as like, if I'm a nationalist American, I hate everybody else. No, that's not how it works. And I mean, because you're on Twitter. Nationalists want everybody to love their own country, because what that's fundamentally doing is people regarding each other as on the same team, helping each other out. I mean, this is all the beautiful things that socialists want. So good. So you have nationalism, but socialism is also, it's very, very popular. Partly it's popular because you can bribe people into it. So this is Bastiat, that when half the population realizes they can live off the other half, we have a problem. And, that sort of goes back to central banking, to taking over money, which then gave government the resources to take over the entirety of society. If we look at what, say, Europe looked like in the late 1800s, it was much, much smaller governments. To the extent they had wars, they were nothing like the 20th century wars. You had like the Franco-Prussian War that lasted, 3 weeks or something. Yeah, they were kind of elegant wars. And that all switched as soon as they introduced central banking, they took over the currency. At that point, you can effectively print yourself the entire wealth of the entire country, which is an unlimited amount, which they did several times in World War I and World War II. So when you have that situation where the government has taken over the printing presses and has a central bank, it reinforces the innate popularity of socialism, right? Because socialism is just taking care of the little guy, right? That's the pitch. And when you have this endless money printer where you can back that up with actually taking care of the little guy, I mean, everybody in Sweden gets money if they want it. They want to stop working and they like to sit on the couch. Everybody does get paid. This is very, very attractive for a lot of people. So it's hard to fight that. And, meanwhile, of course, they're very clever about, they fight flat taxes, which would, disseminate the pain across the entire population. Instead, they go for progressive taxation and going after billionaires. So it's from a sort of marketing perspective, once you're armed with a central bank, socialism is extraordinarily appealing for a huge chunk of the voters, anyway, enough to get over 51%. And so that's something where, even when you have parties like AfD or Sweden Democrats who are open to nationalism, still you've got the, just hand-to-hand combat trying to make sure that the party doesn't veer towards socialism. That's also true for Donald Trump. There's, as much as I love Trump compared to the alternative, there's a lot of stuff he does. He picks up 10% shares of lithium companies using taxpayer money. There's a lot of stuff in there that is not very free market. So, it is hand-to-hand battle. And unfortunately, it's like, once you win one battle, you've got the next one and the next one and the next one. It sort of never ends. The payoff is so large, right? It's millions of lives, turned from slaves into free and independent people. So the payoff is large, but yes, it's battle after battle.
Yeah, that's what Reagan said, right? That the battle for freedom is something every generation will have to fight. There's like no end to it. I truly believe that. Trump's the worst thing about Trump is the tariffs, I think. Like, tariffs are taxes. They are a tariff is not going to make, American workers are not going to get less spoiled and less fat because you put a tariff on another country. That's just not how the economy works. And I would say I would be more of a nationalist if states were smaller. Like, I love the 10,000 Liechtenstein's theory. This is a Hoppian theory. And that's so that there was more optionality and you could actually move with your feet, but you didn't have to move very far in order to get, like, right now, tax havens are rare and you have to move quite far away. Like, for me to actually be in a system that would be close to what I thought was okay, I would have to move to El Salvador or Argentina or something. Like, there's no, even the better places in Europe are still part of the EU and kind of bad in terms of surveillance state and interventionism in general.
Yeah, although in fairness, I will say I am pleasantly surprised at the US tax rate if you run a business. That's something that Trump pushed in his first term, 2017. He pushed tax cuts that they're really, really effective for small business. So, like, if you're a small business in the US, you pay something like 10% tax, which I think is a shocking number for Europeans. It's really not bad. Our tax system is extremely tilted towards small business. I never complain about this because I want more of it, right? I want to get that to 5. But it is pretty impressive here. But having said, the downside, if you happen to be American, is that we cannot escape our taxes by going overseas.
No. Yeah. So, you have the exit tax forever.
Yeah. So, if you move to Dubai and it's got 0% income tax, well, you still have to fill out your American taxes.
Yeah.
Which I think it's us and Liberia that does that. So
Canada too now, right?
Oh, are they doing it? I'm not surprised.
They have an exit tax, I think.
They have an exit tax. Yeah. And I know a lot of Canadians who have decamped to Latin America after baby Doc Trudeau. So I wouldn't be surprised if Canada goes that route.
But I think as we move into the future, Bitcoin fixes this too, because a business does not have to be something that you file and tell the government about anymore. It could just be a Telegram group or a Signal group, or the equivalent of maybe some Nostr solution, and just people doing things with Bitcoin. Mm-hmm. It can just be a group of friends doing stuff. And that's what people don't realize. That's what a business is. And the whole overhead that comes with not only the monetary cost, but all the extra effort you have to put into to do your bookkeeping and your reporting and all of this stuff. That's all extra on top of it, and it's all unnecessary. If we had Ancapistan, we wouldn't have to do any of that. We could just do things, and everything would work so much better. And speaking of the poor, like I think the biggest misconception people have about if we were on a Bitcoin standard, who would benefit the most from it? Of course, the poor, because prices fall for them the most. If I was poor, I mean, the poor people who got their hands on some Bitcoin 10 years ago are not poor anymore because of it, because they're using another denominator. And this is what people can't get into their head.
Yeah, we have a beautiful natural experiment because in 1971, Richard Nixon finished off the gold standard. And the economy, between 1950 and 1970, and then 1970 and 1990, it was more or less the same economy, right? We're not going back to like medieval Europe here to try to get comparables. And you can look at exactly what happened. So after the Nixon shock, after 1971, inflation took off in the US. Before then, it had been like 1.7% for something like 20 years. And then after that, for a good decade or about 12 years or so, it was like 8% a year. And then it continued fairly high after that. So if you look at what happened before and after, the poor suffered. If you look at income levels in the US, the poor were doing amazing in the 50s and 60s to the point that Americans look back at it as a golden age. I think a lot of Europeans do as well because, Europe suffered the exact same process because they were reliant on the US dollar.
Yeah.
So the 50s and 60s were the golden age. And what happened in the 70s and 80s is striking, which is that rich people got richer, right? And, the left put this on Thatcher or Ronald Reagan or neocons or whatever because they don't understand money. So the rich actually got richer. The poor either leveled off or in many cases, like blue collars, they actually ended up going down. And what was happening is that everybody suffered the same inflation, but because of Cantillon effects, that money, it started because of how money is created when interest rates are too low. It gets created by banks or it's created on Wall Street or it gets created directly by the government. Either way, those guys eat first, right? Wall Street, banks, rich people who can borrow money. The vast majority of money borrowed is not borrowed by the poor, it's borrowed by the rich. The poor don't have any collateral, right? Rich people have billion-dollar loans. Poor people have like $400 in a payday loan. Okay, almost all borrowed money goes to rich people. It goes to corporations, which are owned by rich people, and it goes to rich people directly. And so once you had sort of central banking unleashed because of Nixon, everything went up. House prices went up, stocks went up, gold went up, Bitcoin went up. Everything just absolutely skyrocketed. If you look at the price of any asset since 1970, even controlling for inflation, just absolutely through the roof. And, again, the mainstreamers sit back and because they don't understand where this is coming from, this is fundamentally coming from monetary manipulation, they've got a just so story for each one. China did this to the blue collars. The houses were, God, what is their story for the houses? I mean, you've got some zoning and things like that, but, maybe foreigners came in and bought the houses. You've got stories for each one of these things. Why did oil go up? Because the Saudis did this with the thing. You have all these individual stories describing, when you zoom out, it's the exact same freaking process, which is that the purchasing power of the currency went down and asset prices all went up because long-term interest rates went down. And that's almost a mathematical 1/n. And so when the smoke cleared, rich people love inflation, right? The biggest people who would suffer if the Fed closed down would be billionaires. It'd be Wall Street bankers. It'd be corporations. Corporations would actually have to borrow like at market rates. Currently the spread between the Fed's interest rates and what corporations can borrow at is something like 2%. Okay, historically that should be 5. That's a big, big difference, right? That knocks out about a 30-year profit, that difference, right? That's a large difference. Why is it only 2? Because there's an implicit market understanding that the Fed will bail out anything. It'll even bail out corporations, which the Fed did in 2008. I think also in Europe, companies were bailed out. If everything's going to get bailed out, capital is cheap. If capital is cheap, rich people make out like bandits.
Yeah. And the 2008 thing was a cross-party thing.
The uniparty in action, but, everybody agreed, yeah.
Absolutely.
It was actually funny. George W. Bush, as much as I disapprove of him in so many ways, including all the countries he started wars with, he set it off because he originally said he was not going to bail out Wall Street. And it had been understood on Wall Street going back 50, maybe 100 years that Wall Street was going to get taken care of. And W said, yeah, no, I'm going to let Lehman Brothers collapse. That's what set it off, is that Wall Street said, holy crap, we're not getting bailed out. You got to be kidding. If you got rid of the central banks, like, the main function of a central bank, yes, it produces inflation. The main function is to bail out the financial system. And why does the financial system need bailing out? Well, if you promise you'll bail out something, then you're going to need a bailout, right? If I tell you, you can go to the casino and any bet you win, you keep. Any bet you lose, I'll cover. You're not a gambling man today. You will become one.
Yeah.
Right. And so that, in a sense, people ask, when is it going to crash? Right. Because people have been talking about the great crash coming since the 1970s. It's permanently crashed. It's being propped up by these, the permanent bailouts. We had one in 2023, a bunch of banks collapsed in the US and the Fed said, okay, we're going to lend you money. Just tell us what you think the asset is worth. We don't, that was the BTFP. We don't care what the market price is. Just tell us what you imagine it should be. I think it was literally purchase price. So any asset that you bought for $100, now it's worth 20. You said, well, I think it's fundamentally worth 100. So we borrow on that. So just the bailouts are constant. The question is, the bailouts are deeply unpopular. The communist left doesn't like them. The right doesn't like them. Nobody likes bailouts, and yet they endure. So that, to me, that's the trigger, right? Do the people wake up and realize, hey, wait a minute, we don't actually have to bail out Wall Street. We came close in the 2008 crisis. In the US, we had two political movements that came very close to combining. On the right, we had the Tea Party, which opposed bank bailouts. On the left, we had Occupy Wall Street, which opposed bank bailouts. They were very, very close to coming together. And the bat signal went up, and immediately media started on about all the racists. That's when the racist stuff came up, right? Because if those two combined, if the left and the right got together and said, hey, we may disagree on other things, but we certainly agree on this. Why don't we go ahead and get this done? Why don't we end the bailouts for the banking system? Holy smokes, that would have been the end of the gig. And then all of a sudden, you see the media talks about racist, the banks have the rainbow flags and the LGBT pride. Where did that come from? Bankers didn't used to care about that. Why do they care about that now? They pick their side because they realize that, they're afraid that the people will come together, which is very exciting because it means that when the people come together, which, we only have to get lucky once, okay? They get a little lucky every single time. They're going to pull that crap off every single time. We unite once and it's over.
Yeah, I'm going to take this opportunity to shamelessly pitch here. First pitch a website, WTFhappenedin1971.com. Great website with all the graphs, where you can literally see what happened when Nixon dropped the convertibility to gold, or whatever he called it. And also to pitch the Bitcoin Infinity Academy, our other show. And we're going through my second book, Bitcoin Independence Reimagined, where there's a chapter called A Tale of Two Richards, which we did like a couple of weeks back. Here it is. And this is actually talking about Richard Cantillon and Richard Nixon. And how one explained what would happen and the other did that thing like they all do these days. Like Keir Starmer has read Orwell and is thought it was a manual. I mean, yeah. Anyway, there's that.
Gloves up. We know of a knockout Bitcoin wallet. It's the Bitbox 02 Nova Edition, and you can get it at bitbox.swiss. This little thingy has the latest security chip, and you can plug it straight into your iPhone, and it's an overall awesome device. The software interface is super smooth, and it's a very secure hardware wallet. They're one of the oldest hardware wallets in the business. So go to bitbox.swiss/infinity and check out the new Nova edition of the Bitbox right now. Code Infinity gets you a discount. And if you go to bitbox.swiss/infinity, you will automatically get that discount. So there. $15 wrench attacks are one thing, but what if you die? You need some inheritance planning. We have some very wonderful Aussie friends that can take care of that for you. They're called the Bitcoin Advisor. You find them at the Bitcoin Advisor with an ER, not an OR at the end, .com. And they can secure your Bitcoins for generations for a very low fee. So go to bitcoinadvisor.com and check out their inheritance planning stuff right now.
So before we start wrapping this up, is there anything we haven't talked about yet? Any field you'd like to go into or like to talk about before?
I mean, I'm honestly very excited about what's coming next in Europe. It's going to be delayed because the election calendar. Although you guys do have snap elections, we don't have those in the US, but you have snap elections whenever things go pear-shaped, and so it could actually come a lot faster. But I think that Europe is going to out-Trump Trump. I think Europe is going to go hard. When I see a lot of the stuff that's happening right now, I mean, bouncing homeless natives for, random people who show up on a boat. When I say bouncing natives, I mean throwing them out of, homeless shelters and denying them medical care. I think, typically in socialized medicine, you have to wait a long time for care. The care is not always that great. And now you got to stand in line behind the million people who just showed up. I mean, when I see Lenin talked about when you have a society where you start to have these disconnects and start to have sort of puddles of anger and resentment, that can get very explosive. And so, normally you would have some elections and things would kind of calm down a little bit and it would let out some of the steam. This is kind of the function of democracy is to, let people express themselves and have a little bit of power, not too much power, but a little bit of power before they blow up. And the European establishment is fighting so hard to prevent that. They've got these electoral pacts where they quarantine and, they sort of shut out the populace like in Germany. And of course, if you do that, it just gets more extreme. I attended a talk a couple of years ago by a former prime minister of Canada, Harper, and he talked about how the U.S. establishment at that time, this was 2019, how the U.S. establishment was trying to shut out Donald Trump. And he said, if you succeed in shutting out Donald Trump, you might manage it. You've got all the media, you've got all these tools. You might manage to shut him out. But if you do that, you're not going to like what comes next. And I think that Europe is very much in that stage where if you look at people like Marine Le Pen, Javier, what's his name in France? Bardot?
The name escapes me too.
Yeah, you're right.
No, Marine Le Pen is in France.
She's in France, and then she got banned by lawfare, so she can't run. So she got another.
Yeah.
Anyway, or like Wilders in
Netherlands. Yeah.
Netherlands. Yeah. Yeah. So, like, if you look at the current generation of populists in Europe, they're still very, very soft. They want to deport criminals, and I mean, things that are very, very common sense. They really haven't gotten extreme. Unfortunately, I think that the European leadership, it is so such a gap has opened with the people that I think it's genuinely afraid of the people at this point. And so, when I look at the free speech restrictions, for example, I think they are going to do everything they can to lock these relative moderates out. If they succeed, there's going to be a next generation, and they're not. They're not going to be fun. And the reason that they'll come is that the people will get angry and angry and angrier. So, I think the U.S. let out a lot of steam recently with Trump. There are a lot of, people who were getting very angry and thinking about kinetic solutions. And because of Trump, a lot that steam is coming out. I think that Europe, they're not going to let that steam come out. And so I think that the pain's going to endure longer in Europe, but that Europe, I think, is going to get ugly in the next 10 years.
Yeah, well, I mean, we don't have a two-party system the same way the U.S. has, or like most European countries, it's like 8 parties, and they're wobbling up and down, and it really becomes a two-party thing anyway, because it's what either side is like one side or the other, and they're really a uniparty. But the thing is, in the U.S., even in that two-party system, a guy like Donald Trump could climb the ladders and go to the top. I think that's more unlikely in one of these smaller European parties, because you have to be such a conformist to get, and then you have to get that party to get a very big majority of the votes. I mean, right now, the Sweden Democrats, who, as I told you before, are a bit of socialist, or not a bit of, they're very socialist, especially in comparison to AfD in Germany, for instance. But they're still working with a quote-unquote right-wing government. Yeah. Calling anything in Sweden a right-wing is just hilarious to me. But they're not in the actual government, but they're in parliament supporting them. So I think it's harder for something like that to happen in Europe.
I agree with you in normal times. The counterpoint is if we look at El Salvador, right? So Salvador is also a multi-party system. It had always been dominated by kind of a uniparty, a little bit left, a little bit right. And when Bukele came in, there was so much frustration towards that uniparty that Bukele got like 90% support. They banned his party, like right before the election. So he went and found another party to carry him. They banned that one. And I think he signed with another party. You know, there were like a bunch of micro parties. And he called up this one micro party like the day before the deadline to ban parties. So like, I think it was like 12 hours before the election or something. And he signed with them, put it out on the radio and on the internet. And then the next day he won, I don't know, 80, 90% of the vote. So that I think is where it ultimately comes to. If we're talking about today in the sort of evolutionary sense over the next 5 or 10 years, I think you're absolutely right. There's going to be small changes. And I think the overwhelming response of the European elite is going to be, number one, censorship. Try to stigmatize any view that's contrary to them. And number two, these kinds of error where you take parties and exclude them, right? Even if they have 35% of the vote, you get all the other parties to join together, which is what Germany's been doing. So, right, in the sort of normal, orderly operations, I think that's what happens. That, I think, is going to lead to so much frustration that they're eventually going to have an El Salvador moment where none of it works, right? You're going to have some person come in. Now, Bukele, thank God, is not socialist. He grew up as a communist, and he saw them from the inside, and he rejected them. The question is, will the European Bukeles will they be more like that, or will they be more, combining nationalism and socialism, which has happened before?
Well, Bukele is not entirely libertarian either. So I would say, there is still some statism going on. You can't be a politician and be libertarian at the same time. It's just
correct.
So what I hope will happen more than anything is that people take matters into their own hands more and start using the freedom tools that are there, like Bitcoin and Nostr and everything else, to just do things without asking for permission. Like that's what we really need, because meet the new boss, same as the old boss, still applies. Not your keys, not your coins, also still applies. So I'd say that's where the real revolution happens. It's personal, not collective. We have to take individually. We have to free ourselves. I think that's more crucial than anything.
Yeah, and that's a really good point. The vast majority of all these things we talk about, inflation and silver prices and whatever, because it's shared experience. But you're absolutely right. Almost the entirety of your life is under your control. There are very, very few moments in human history have had more liberty than today. And that's worldwide. Right? Any country you can name today, and you compare to what liberty, the Democratic Republic of Congo, all right, what did liberty used to look like there 300 years ago? Oh my goodness. Right? Every country on earth, there are just an incredible amount of liberty, meaning liberty to start a business, to, make your own life choices, to choose your money, right? And yes, you've got these things happening on the outside, but you're absolutely right. Focus inward, focus on things you can control, which is almost all of it.
Yeah, practical liberty. I mean, I think the Misesian definition of freedom is the sphere in which you can choose between different modes of action. So, I mean, they can threaten you and tell you to not do this and not do that, but you can still live a moral, ethical life, just a lawful life rather than a legal life, just picking and choosing whatever things you wish to listen to and just not give a shit about the others. There's a risk attached, of course, and I'm not telling everyone to go ahead and be a criminal, but I'm also saying don't pay too much attention to what the man behind the curtain tells you to do, because no successful businessman ever did that. They walked their own path and they took care of the problems afterwards and carve your own path. That's crucial, I think.
One of the things that Seyfried talks about is how hard money changes the culture. Yeah. And, you see that in Bitcoiners, right? That even though we're living in this confetti environment, right, we are living in a hard money world. And you see it in terms of investment, forward or future orientation, choosing a wife who's going to be a long-term investment, building a business or building hard skills. Like you see people converting, which is very exciting because, you can extrapolate that, the number of Bitcoiners is growing all the time. Eventually, I think we're going to have our moment where hard money takes over. And, when you just look at the Bitcoiners around you, it is very exciting what's coming. And, if you are a Bitcoiner, you got expectations, man. Do stuff, build stuff.
Yeah, and we're all incentivized to help one another because the success of Bitcoin is the success of other Bitcoiners. So we're incentivized 100%. To be awesome to one another, and that's why it's the most beautiful community in the world.
It really is.
Peter or Professor St Onge, thank you very much for coming on to the show. Where can people find you on the internet? Where do you want to send our listeners? Where can they find out more?
Yeah, so I make daily videos. They're about 3.5 minutes, so bite-sized. Those go up every weekday on Twitter or X. So Prof St Onge, ProfStonge. And then I also do a weekly Substack, taking like one article every week and talking through that. So that's at profstonge.com.
Fantastic. And great to have you here. I absolutely love this conversation, and I think we should do this at least yearly going forward. And hope to see you at one of the conferences also. Let's see which one it becomes. I don't know when my next North American one is. Well, I'm going to El Salvador in November, but other than that, I don't know.
That's a good one. Yeah, absolutely. With safety. Nice.
Take care.
Okay, thanks. You too.
This has been the Bitcoin Infinity Show. Brush your teeth. Goodbye.